My name is Chris, though you might recognize my voice from another channel, called Stoehovve, where I do various tutorial videos for Fantasy Grounds Unity. In collaboration with Smiteworks, I am going to provide an update on how to use the combat tracker with respect to 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons from a player's point of view. One of the most important features within Fantasy Grounds Unity is the combat tracker itself. As a player, you won't use the combat tracker as often as a Dungeon Master does, but it is still going to be extremely important with respect to a given combat-based situation. And because of that, I will explain what information you're going to see in the panel, though there are some configurable options that the Dungeon Master can make use of that might include more or less information depending on how they have things set up. As with the Dungeon Master's version of this video, I won't be going into any detail about those settings, as I've already published videos that cover the aspects of the interface that configure those settings. But to be thorough, I will include the link in the description below in case you're curious as to what those things are. Additionally, I will be recording a third video in this series, and that video is going to be where we will see an example encounter within the combat tracker. This video is simply informational in the sense that I'm going to explain what you will be seeing in that combat tracker. So with that, let's get started in relation to what you can see within the combat tracker itself, as long as no settings are altered. As a player, it can be easy to lose track of when your turn is going to come around, or what the overall health of your character currently is. You won't have to keep track of as much information as a Dungeon Master, but you still need to understand who or what's involved in any given encounter, and be able to do things in a reasonably controlled way, and when required. This is where the combat tracker is going to come into play. It's going to show you information that is relevant to your party, your character, any hostile or friendly NPCs or creatures that happen to be in the combat tracker, as well as any visible objects or vehicles that are relevant. This is going to give you the information you need in order to decide what you're going to do on any given moment during your turn, when combined with the available actions that your character can execute. Let's say, for instance, you're playing a cleric, and a party member is in trouble due to high amounts of damage they have suffered during a given encounter. You'll see enough information in the combat tracker without really having to ask the details from the affected character's player. And it will allow you to make the choice of what do you want to do. Do I help them or by healing their character, or do I continue attacking the creature that is hitting them so heavily in the hopes that they go down before they take that character down? It gives you the information that allows you to judge the situation and then make that choice as to what your character is going to do, allowing the overall flow of an encounter to continue to move forward and contribute to the story rather than detract from it because of one reason or another. I currently happen to have the combat tracker open, but if this is your first time accessing Fantasy Grounds, you're going to find that underneath the tool submenu here. And if it's not yet expanded, you can just simply click on this tool word here. It will expand down this icon list, and then your combat tracker here is the one with the double swords, the ones with the cross swords. You click that, and it will pop this open. The first time you see it, your character and any party members and other creatures might not yet be in place. Although, as a Dungeon Master, I usually generally prepare that in advance, so in my case, most of this is already pre-populated before the players even see it. And that may be the case for other Dungeon Masters as well. Now, I'm currently showing 2 hostile creatures there. If your characters don't realize that there are hostile creatures around, they might not be visible within the combat tracker. But in this case, I'm highlighting those just to show you what the difference is going to be between players and allies versus those that are hostile to your party. Let's say, for example, that I hadn't yet exposed these orcs to you, and they have the ability to see in the dark and be able to shoot out enough distance to be able to hit your character before you can see them. Maybe they're using a short bow or a long bow, doesn't much matter. In any event, you might be getting attacked and not realize where that is coming from. It might take a round or two for your party members to calculate the trajectory of the incoming attacks and be able to figure out where the combatants are. And this is where the first integration of other Fantasy Grounds Unity features comes into place, because it's most likely that the map has line of sight functionality enabled, thus controlling what your character can and cannot see. And don't worry about trying to figure out what that looks like here. I will be displaying what that looks like inside of the encounter video. As your character moves closer to that orc and eventually gains the means to see them, there's a chance, if the Dungeon Master has this configured properly, that they appear within the combat tracker as soon as your character spots them, Thus, you'll be able to target them and begin to execute your own forms of combat against them or retaliation against them. And it still allows Dungeon Masters to provide that level of surprise for you, because you might have found that one orc, but you might not yet see the other 10 or 9 that happen to be around them. So you might decide to make an attack against that particular orc and then sort of wake up the nest, if you will, when it comes to the rest of the orcs, and all of a sudden you're now fighting 11 orcs that you weren't necessarily prepared to handle. So this is where some of the stress and fun of dealing with these kinds of situations makes Dungeons & Dragons fun. At the top of the panel, you will see information details here that are going to line up with quote-unquote a column or field that happens to reside below them. So the names would be here, the initiative rolls are here, the health-related status information is here, and a couple of other features here that we'll explain in a moment. I'll also cover what these details here are. And the first thing that you might notice are these tokens here. These tokens are what will line up to the creature that happens to be on the map. And as you can see, I have multiple orcs in this particular case. So identifying an orc just by its token is going to be very complicated when you're just looking at it in the map. So when you actually use the combat tracker, you can actually target the orc in question that you're looking to make an attack of directly from the combat tracker. You don't have to do that from the map. But at the same time, you can still right-click, left-click, on that particular token that it's on the map, and it will target the right orc inside of the combat tracker. And again, that'll be displayed during the encounter video. And as such, these names are going to flow differently depending on the information that's being displayed. So your character is going to be here. Any allies might have suffixes at the end of them to denote uniqueness. Multiple kinds of hostile creatures are going to have suffixes like this 1 and this number 2 here to denote uniqueness there. But that's not always the case. That could be a unique name. This might be called club-footed orc, or this might be called orc with missing ear, things like that. There's information that will allow you to provide a unique identifier to be able to identify on the map which one you're attacking. Otherwise, it gets very confusing to say, yeah, I'm going to attack that orc there. Which orc? Well, that orc there. I'm sorry, I can't see where you're pointing. The one that I have highlighted. That kind of discussion shouldn't necessarily happen during an active DM session. If it is, then you need to talk your Dungeon Master into providing suffixes for the multiple creatures that they have that happen to have the same name. And of course, this assumes that your characters have actually identified these creatures. If I choose to mark these unidentified like I just did, this is what you will see. It might not be a bad idea to take a moment and have one of your party members go through and try to figure out who or what these things are. And then observe them, gather some information, and if you can't quite identify who or what they are here, take that information back and go back to somebody who knows what they could have been. Thus, the next time that you encounter an orc, you know exactly what they are. To the left of that token is what I've been calling the action token, or it's a turn indicator or an action indicator to denote which particular creature or character is actively going through a particular round. So this barbarian here has the active turn. They're the ones that are going during this particular second round. Additionally, any active creature or player that is going is going to have this thicker version of their bar around it, and it's going to match the color that's associated with the background. So these two will be red, these two will be green. As a player, you can only affect your own player character in the sense of being able to do anything with your character. When your turn is active, chances are you're going to be spending quite a bit of time here in your action sheet running one or more of these particular features, making attack rolls, casting spells if you have the ability to do so, things like that. But unless you're controlling multiple characters, which is possible to do, you aren't going to be able to affect anybody else's character unless you're dropping effects onto them. Things like executing healing spells for them and on their characters, or giving them a bonus because let's say you're a cleric, as our previous example was, and you're giving them the Bless capability, which allows them to roll an additional 1d4 during their next roll. Of course, they still get to choose when that applies, but those are the kinds of things that you can affect when it comes to things in the combat tracker for your party. When it comes to hostile creatures, chances are you're attacking them, you're casting a spell at them, you're throwing an effect at them, you're rolling damage against them, or you're knocking them prone or doing other things which are going to be adding conditions to them. But short of using a reaction, This is really the only time that you can go through and actually make use of any form of feature here that isn't reaction based. It has to be done on your turn, and it will be noted by this turn indicator, and when the turn rolls around, you will theoretically hear a chime when it is your turn to go. And the reason why I say that is because the chime is something that you yourself can turn off. It's in the configurable settings that are applicable to a player configuration for the combat tracker. To the right of the name is going to be the column that represents your initiatives. And you can potentially see hostile creature initiative rolls, which I have displayed here. You will generally always see party member initiative rolls, as I've displayed here. We don't have one yet for this character because I haven't rolled one just yet. But generally, it's going to order it based off the order defined by the initiative roll. So Orc 1, Orc 2, they get to go first. This Gold Dragon is going at some point down the turn because you don't know whether I have additional creatures hidden in here or not. And then the Barbarian currently isn't set to go because they haven't rolled an initiative. And generally, most Dungeon Masters will allow you really to only see party initiatives and party health related stuff. You won't always get to see the hostile creature initiative rolls. In this case, I am intentionally displaying it to give you an idea as to what that would look like. This is what it looks like when the initiative rolls are set to only be visible to friends or allies of your particular character. You can see this initiative roll for the Gold Dragon, but you can't see them for the Orc anymore. So you don't know the defined turn order here in this particular case, because even though these two go first before these two characters do at this particular point in time, you don't see that. So what's going to end up happening is that from your point of view, the turn indicator is going to bounce around the combat tracker. It's not going to go top to down like it will on the Dungeon Master side. And in case you're not aware of how this works, what the initiative does is defines the order within a given turn. And I'm really explaining this for anyone who's not familiar with Dungeons & Dragons. It starts with the highest initiative roll at the top and works its way down to the bottom. And there are certain initiative rolls, like initiative roll 20, for instance, where other actions can be done by specific creatures if they have those capabilities. In a lot of ways, it is possible for the initiative to bounce around a combat tracker and not really make any sense. As a Dungeon Master, though, I will usually display the initiative rolls just so that people understand what the explicit turn order is going to be. However, I only display the initiative rolls for creatures that are visible. That way, I can still retain a hidden surprise if I need to, yet you still have the comfort level of knowing where you are roughly within the turn indicator. And to the right of the initiative, we see the player health, which I've already alluded to. And these next three fields all represent the health for the players themselves as well as for hostile creatures. And you will see numbers in respect to hostile creatures if the Dungeon Master happens to have that enabled. This right here is the default configuration when it comes to what you as a player will see within the combat tracker. You will see a summary of what their total number of hit points are for allies and players, how many temporary hit points they have, as well as how many wounds they have suffered. When it comes to the quote-unquote detailed information that you will see here, generally it will be multiple states of different text, and then the coloring on this text will change to indicate a little bit more of a serious status for that particular creature. The values that you see here in the total hit point section, if you will not change unless you as a character are leveling up to a new level, a party member is leveling up to a new level, or the Dungeon Master is making adjustments to these values. The temporary hit point field is only going to contain numbers in it if someone has acquired temporary hit points, and there are some spells and features that grant that capability. And the way that things will work is that when you suffer damage, if you have 10, for example, 10 temporary hit points and you suffer 11 points of damage, all 10 of those temporary hit points will be removed and your character will only take 1 wound point. Regardless as to whether you have a numerical representation being displayed here versus a text-based representation like we see here, the more wounds a particular character is going to suffer, the more colorful the text is going to be. It will start green, and then it will slowly change to a shade of red, to a deep red, so on and so forth. Eventually to the point where, when the total number of wounds equals the total number of hit points, and it relates to an NPC, that creature is now effectively dead. When it relates to a player, that player is now effectively unconscious. But at the same time, wounds don't always have to go up. wounds themselves can go down. If you have received healing and you had 30 hit points of wounds, but you received 31 hit points of healing, then the wounds would disappear. But if you received 28 hit points of healing, you would still have 3 wounds left. And the coloration changes based on key percentage values in relation to the text coloration. By default, I believe it's 25%, 50%, and 75% is when the coloration changes. So it would be 25% of the value of this, 50% of the value of that, 75% of the value of that, and then there might be one final change near the end. It all comes down to what level of detail the Dungeon Master has that gauge set for. The next field here is going to be a faction indicator. This is going to represent what the friendliness state is in relation to the party. Green means that they are friends or allies. Yellow means that they are neutral to the situation. Red means that they are hostile. And then no color at all with a black icon here for the skull will indicate that they have no affiliation to any faction. Now, what do I mean by a faction? Well, I've already stated that particular portion of it in the sense that it relates to what a given creature, NPC, object, or vehicle, or anything else that happens to be in the combat tracker, relates to with respect to the party. And there are 4 states: none, hostile, neutral, and ally or friend. All of those combined can have different colorations, and you will see those here in the example that I will be displaying later. As a player, you can't change the faction color, if you will. You can't actually click on this and have any effect on any of these things here. Only the Dungeon Master can actually make that change. And it's the faction that's going to define the coloration that you see here for the backgrounds. Allies are going to be green, hostiles are going to be red. You will have a yellowish orange color for those that are neutral, and for those that have no affiliation whatsoever, it's just going to be the coloration on the panel, so whatever this beigeish yellow color is here. Of course, if the Dungeon Master has a theme that changes the coloration of this panel, then that quote-unquote none faction will have whatever color that happens to be. And this, of course, assumes that there aren't any themes out there that would make color adjustments to these particular backgrounds here as well. I actually don't know if that's possible because I don't do theme work, so... Unlike the Dungeon Master, when it comes to targeting creatures, you're not going to have an icon here that will allow you to affect that list. What will instead happen is that as you target a given creature, you're going to get a textual summary down here that's just below your character's name. Although if you expand this out, it goes below the effects listing as well. And it will simply list all of the creatures that you happen to have targeted. As you add and remove targets, that list is going to grow and shrink. And it can be automatically done as well. For instance, if you're a spellcaster and you have the Orc 1 and Orc 2 creatures here targeted and then throw a fireball at them, if they both made their saving throw, you can roll the damage against them and then they're going to vanish from your target list. If, however, you happen to have a creature that makes a saving throw and you're not throwing something at them that does half damage, but it just simply is a miss, they will simply disappear from the list before you roll your damage. And when it comes to specific kinds of effects, things like going prone or stuff like that, if you have forced them to roll a saving throw and there's a prone element that comes into play here, then anybody who succeeded will be removed and then you'll be able to apply the prone effect to those that remain. And it's extremely important for your character because it allows you to know exactly who your character has targeted, thus allowing you to take advantage of some of the key combat features built into Fantasy Grounds Unity and your character sheet. For instance, if I have these 2 creatures here targeted, if I happen to have an area of effect spell, it will attack both of them. But for melee-based capabilities, unless there's a sweep action that's coming into play, chances are you're only going to have one particular orc or one particular creature selected. And when you roll the damage, it's going to go against the target here, although in this case I rolled a hit. So I attacked Orc 1, I hit, I didn't have to do the other option of attacking them, which is dragging and dropping the dice on top of them. In both cases I hit, so I can just double click this to roll the damage. And it allows you to take care of that automation and that connectivity between the combat tracker and the character sheet without having to go, oh, how do I do this? And oh, what do I need to do in order to actually attack? Things like that. It's somewhat intuitive. Oh, I just drag and drop. Okay. Right. I drag and drop. It's not an overly complicated process once you get used to it. And you'll see multiple examples of that when I go through and run an actual encounter scenario for you. The icon here that has the stunned head kind of looking like a thing is called an effects field. And what this does is it's where you're going to find any effects or conditions that are being applied to your character, other characters that you've applied effects to and aren't hidden, as well as party members that you've applied effects to that could be granting them bonuses, for example. As a player, you will only be able to manage effects that you yourself have applied, whether it's to your character, whether it's to an ally, or whether it's to hostile creatures. It doesn't much matter. You will not be able to affect, if you will, and that's an effect with an A, any other effects that happen to be in place in relation to your character, for instance, or any allies or hostile creatures, if they weren't applied by your own character. Of course, that assumes the Dungeon Master hasn't actually enabled that setting. And the one thing you need to understand about Fantasy Grounds is that effects only function while your character or while a hostile creature or an ally is in the combat tracker. You can apply effect to a particular creature, but if they're removed from the combat tracker, that effect is gone. It will only be triggered through the turn processing that happens within the combat tracker. And that means that if you have racial traits or any sort of class bonus or feature that grants you more or less a permanent effect, you're going to have to reapply that every time you're re-added to the combat tracker. Although there are extensions that do allow that to happen automatically for you. Some of them are finicky, but most of them do work fairly well. When an effect is applied to a particular creature, it's always going to be visible. So if I apply the effect to our Berserker here, it doesn't matter whether I have this expanded out or not, it's always going to be visible. And you could potentially, I suppose, apply the effect to another particular creature. I'm just trying to think of, do I have one here that I can throw on another creature? Yeah, I'll do this, even though it's really meant to be for my own creature, or character rather. I can throw it here. You can see that doesn't matter whether it's your character or an ally, and the same thing will happen with any hostile creatures. You will always see a summary of effects that are there if they are visible to players. That's the key factor. There are some effects that can be hidden from the players by the Dungeon Master. When you access the effects submenu here, you gain a number of controls that you can now make use of. For instance, if you want to disable rage, for example, you can actually just turn it off just simply by left-clicking on this button. And I'll run through these here in a moment. But it does give you the ability to control that effect, whether it's enabled or disabled. You can also ensure that an effect is going to only be applicable when a certain creature or object or whatever comes into play. So whether you're attacking a particular creature, for instance, this rage effect would only apply to this orc. It would not be applicable for anything specific to Orc 2, although that's not how rage works. I was just using that as an example. This area here where you see the keyword on, this is a toggle. And there are 3 possible states that you could make use of. On means that the effects are going to be processed with respect to your character, if it happens to be on your character, and the round is moving forward. Skip means that it's going to skip this particular turn. However, if there is a duration that shows up here, like this here has a duration of 10, for instance, then what's actually going to happen is that when you set it to skip, it's still going to count that duration down. And just to be clear, when you're using the skip section here, the effects will not be applied to whoever you have that particular effect tied to, whether it's your own character, whether it's a hostile creature, whether it's another character or ally in your party here. As long as that skip is there, it will just simply skip the turn. Once the turn ends, the skip will turn back to on. The final toggleable configuration is off, which means that the effects here will not apply at all. And once again, doesn't matter whether it's off in relation to the gold dragon, whether it's off in relation to the orc or orc 2 here. If you put that effect on a particular creature or yourself, and then you turned it off, then what was the point of putting the effect there? Now, this does have a use, and I will explain that in a moment. One thing about off is it will no longer count down the duration. So if it had 10 turns when you turned it off as the remaining duration that this particular effect was going to be around, then you could go through 100 turns and that counter will never go down. Now, an example of this might be specific to the Berserker-based character here, because they do gain the ability to ignore things like the charm or the frightened effect when they're enraged, and they make use of one of their features. I believe that is mindless rage. That means that you could theoretically toggle that charm or the frightened effect off on your character, although you wouldn't necessarily be able to do that. The Dungeon Master would do that for you because it's most likely being applied by somebody else, not your own character. And then when your rage effect goes away, they would re-enable those particular effects from either the charm or the frightened effect, and then you would be applied and have to deal with that with respect to your character. Now, I already showed you a brief example of how to make use of that targeting reticule, which is this right here. And what this does is it is used to narrow the scope of an effect to a specific set of creature or creatures, because it can be done for multiple. So I can drag it onto both of these orcs, and then whenever these orcs attack my character or I attack them, any bonuses or benefits that I gain from being enraged will be applicable to them. It won't apply to our dragon here. For instance, if I pop open and drop this damage +2 effect onto our character here, I'm going to just get rid of this for now so that it clears out that, and I drag this onto Orc 1. If I were to go ahead and roll damage against Orc 1, you see here that we have a +7 bonus to that damage. The effect is going to go away, but I have a +9 bonus to the damage. That means that the +2 effect was applicable. Now, if I pop that effect back onto our character, redrag that onto Orc 1, and then roll damage on Orc 2, you will see that we get a +2 bonus here. That's because, a +7 bonus, because the +2 bonus doesn't get added onto this to bring it up to a +9. So that's how you can narrow the scope of things like this. And this is useful for things like Hunter's Mark, any effect that has a very specific narrowed listing of creatures that it would be applicable to, things like that. And if you have ever seen any of my class and class specialization tutorial videos, there are several examples that do provide in more detail how that works, because I do go through and make sure that I cover each and every feature specific to that class or class specialization to ensure that you have A, your characters created or configured rather appropriately, and B, you know how to use them. And finally, the last option here, which you've also seen me use during this particular recording, is this delete item icon. And what it does is it allows you to double click on that effect and remove it. So you click once to convert the vertical line to a horizontal line, and then you click again to confirm the deletion. It's done that way to prevent accidental deletion. So if I just sort of minimize that window, it will reset the state of that deletion icon. And I've done that a couple of times where I've accidentally clicked on this and I'm like, oh, I don't want to get rid of that yet. So I'll just do this and clear that out and away I go. But as I said earlier, you won't be able to remove effects that are placed on your character that were applied there by somebody else. So any effect on your character that you put on your own character or on somebody else's character or another creature, you can remove. But anything that gets put onto your character, you cannot remove. And the last piece of information that I really want to go over is down here at the bottom, right? As well as this indicator here. You might know what this turn indicator is, but how do you pass it along? So when your turn is done, the very first thing that you're going to want to do is click this icon down here. And that's going to pass that token onto the next actor in this list. This thing here is simply going to keep track of how many rounds you've gone through. So in this particular case, we're into round 3. And even though I'm clicking on this to try to push our combat through, we're not going to get out of round 3 until the Dungeon Master themselves has finished going through whatever creatures and actions that they have to deal with, as well as any other players have gone or any allies have gone. You can only pass the token in relation to your own character, and the only time that this is going to increment is if you're the last one in the list, you click that, it will auto increment this encounter here, and then prepare for the next round. As you can see, the Combat Tracker has a large number of features that are integrated into it, and this works in conjunction with other panels, such as the character sheet, maps, and a slew of other areas that you could potentially be making use of. This is why I always say that the Combat Tracker is one of the most important panels within Fantasy Grounds Unity with respect to executing an efficient combat-based encounter. And even though we haven't actually visually seen one yet, you'll see that once we get there, that is probably a fairly accurate statement. If you have not already done so, I highly recommend you watch the example encounter video next. It will show you how the overall flow of a complex combat-based situation can progress and show you how it functions within the Combat Tracker. However, with that, I want to thank you for watching this video on behalf of SmiteWorks and myself. I also want to thank SmiteWorks for providing me with the opportunity to present this information on their channel, and I look forward to continuing with our collaboration. Please click on the like button if you found the information in this video useful to helping you learn how to use the Fantasy Grounds Unity Combat Tracker panel, and consider subscribing to the SmiteWorks Fantasy Grounds YouTube channel to keep up to date with new content as it is released. If you have questions or comments about this video, feel free to post them in the comment section of the video below in order to contribute to the discussion.